Hello, welcome to BEH 101 Introduction to Behavioral Health. In this presentation, we'll be discussing violence, victim advocacy, and corrections. So, what we're going to be talking about initially is the field of forensic human services. And this includes areas in which the human services discipline intersects with the legal system. So if you're thinking of a Venn diagram, kind of imagine that part of it is the legal system and part of it is human services, and they have that little piece in between that connects them. Human service professionals work in practice settings dealing with domestic violence, sexual assault, gang activity, and criminal justice agencies such as police departments, probation, state, and county prosecutors, and within correctional facilities such as jails and prisons, and all of these are considered to be forensic human service providers. The role and function of these practitioners will vary dramatically depending on the legal or criminal issues at play, but most forensic service providers require specialized training in areas such as crime victimization and crisis counseling, as well as developing a thorough understanding of the legal and criminal justice system. Counseling victims of domestic violence requires specialized training that focuses on the unique dynamic commonly at play in abusive relationships. One significant element of counseling victims of domestic violence is assisting them in making decisions about their future that will not compromise their safety. Although behavioral health professionals may not actually tell the clients to leave an abusive relationship, they will often lead abused clients down this path, particularly if it is the only way to secure their safety and if the batterer has refused to enter into any structured treatment program. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, which is a more inclusive term than domestic violence, involves the physical, sexual, and/or emotional abuse acted out between intimate people in a relationship. This violence could include husbands and wives, violence between boyfriends and girlfriends, violence within gay and lesbian relationships, and violence between family members such as siblings and parent-child, etc. Intimate partner violence can include hitting, punching, slapping, pinching, shoving, and throwing objects at or near the victim or threatening to do so. IPV also includes verbal and emotional abuse, including name-calling, harassment, taunting, put-downs, ridiculing, and sexual violence, such as forcing an intimate partner to engage in a sexual act without his or her consent. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, i.e. the CDC, estimates that 1 in 3 women, their numbers are 36%, and 1 in 4 men, which is about 29% of the U.S. population, report having been a victim of some sort of intimate partner violence in 2010. Nearly 325,000 women are victims of domestic violence while pregnant, and research suggests that pregnancy can actually make women more vulnerable to abuse. The estimated healthcare costs related to domestic violence is close to $6 million per year and $1.8 billion in lost productivity, including lost time from work, unemployment, and increased dependence on public aid. Children living in the home are victims as well, even if the violence is not aimed directly towards them. Boys who witness domestic violence are twice as likely to commit violence against their partners when they grow up and become adults. Intimate partner violence costs U.S. society approximately $5.8 million per year in lost revenue, with victims of IBV missing collectively about 8 million days from work and direct costs for mental and physical health care. So if you're thinking, like, why does somebody miss work? Think about it from even the perspective of your spouse or your partner gives you a black eye. Do you want to go into work looking that way? So you might stay home, put an ice bag on your eye, and hope the swelling goes down, get some makeup and cover it up, and try to go back the next day. These are all issues that people are experiencing, and they don't want to advertise that they are being victimized because they feel guilty, they feel shame, they feel all of these emotions that are not rational, but they've been made to feel this way. And that's why it is such a big issue in this country. So let's talk about the nature of domestic violence and how it becomes a cycle of violence. So oftentimes you have what's called the honeymoon-like state. Abusers often tell their new partner that they are the only people in the world that they can trust and the only ones who truly understand them. And when you're in a new relationship and you are drunk on that feeling of love and oxytocin is being pushed out of your body, and you just feel so loving and wonderful, and this partner is making you feel like the best person on earth, and you begin to trust them. You begin to feel like they're the only ones who understand you. Once the abusers feel comfortable in the relationship, however, a dual process occurs. First, the abusers begin to feel vulnerable by recognizing their partner's power to hurt them. So, the partner that you're madly in love with is beginning to feel uncomfortable knowing that they're now beholden to you, and then plagued with fears that they will be abandoned or taken advantage of and or humiliated, as many were in their childhoods. They become jealous, possessive, and the accusations begin. Emotional immaturity often prevents abusers from being able to separate their internal feelings from the possible causes. So, in a sense, what's happening here is that the abuser is so worried about losing their partner that they become abusive, which only creates an environment of fear and anxiety for the entire family. A common assumption among batterers is that if they feel badly, their partners must be doing something to cause it. Innocent partners often become the focus of the batterer's mistrust, fear, and ultimately their rage. Most partners of batterers will sense the increasing tension brought about by the abuser's underlying anger that is bubbling to the surface. In response, most victims do their best to walk on eggshells to avoid an explosion. No amount of running interference or offered reassurances will help because the process is an internal one, occurring within the mind of the abuser. So, once that switch is flipped, the innocent partner is the punching bag, whether it's an emotional punching bag, a sexual punching bag, or a physical punching bag, because the person who does the abusing feels that their happiness is somehow under attack because they feel vulnerable. And that's really where it comes from, is that vulnerability. Eventually, the explosion occurs despite all of the peacemaking efforts, so you can only walk on eggshells for so long. And once batterers have experienced a violent rage, they are often temporarily relieved of their internal feelings of rage, and in many respects take on the persona of a remorseful child seeking reassurance and approval. Batterers often promise never to repeat the abusive behavior. This is a common manipulative aspect to the batterer's professions of regret and apologies, with the expression of authentic remorse being somewhat questionable. And, for most of us who, if you watch television or go to movies, you've seen the cycle play out on screen, if not in your own life. And it's like that moment where they lose their mind, they beat up their partner, and then all that rage leaves them, and they become a little child looking for, oh, please forgive me, please forgive me. And, there is a mixed message being sent to the person who is being abused. Rarely is the batterer's focus on the pain and trauma caused to the partner or other family members. Rather, the honeymoon phase involves more of a panicked pleading, begging the victim not to leave, to forgive and forget, to move on quickly by minimizing the extent of the abuse. With the hope that the honeymoon phase might just last forever, victims often comply with these dangerous demands of the batterer to relinquish their own sense of reality and accept the reality of the batterer, that the abuse was not that bad, it will never happen again, and it was a one-time event. What you're dealing with here is a person whose mental state is so unable to process how they're feeling, they lash out in rage, almost like a 2-year-old. If you've ever been around a toddler, you know that one little thing can set them off and they go into a total meltdown. Well, that's kind of what we're looking at here in terms of the batterer being emotionally immature and not being able to manage their own feelings. So whose fault is it anyway? Well, no matter how many promises the abusive partner makes, or how desperately the victim wants to believe the abuse will never occur, without intervention, the cycle is destined to repeat itself. Victims have a tendency to see themselves as responsible for more than they actually are, and they do not necessarily recognize when their personal responsibility ends and when someone else's begins. And this is called an internal locus of control. Those with an external locus of control have a tendency to see outside factors as responsible for the events in their lives. Batterers commonly have an external locus of control and blame their partners, as well as a host of other people and things, for their mistakes and failures. And this makes them a good match for a partner with an internal locus of control. So you have somebody who blames everyone, and then you have somebody else who blames themselves all the time. Well, it is a match made perfectly, like two pieces fitting together. Those with a healthy locus of control will be able to recognize when something lies inside or outside their domain of responsibility. A healthy locus of control indicates that someone has good personal boundaries and will likely refuse to accept responsibility for something she knew was not her fault, or he knew was not his fault. But many victims of domestic violence do not have a healthy personal boundaries and readily accept responsibility for virtually everything that is wrong in their relationship or with their partner. So the batterer, in a sense, externalizes the blame, and the victim internalizes the blame. And again, what you have there is that locus of control being the defining factor. A theory attempting to explain this core issue in domestic violence relationships focuses on attribution theory, specifically exploring how the victim attributes or characterizes the partner's abusive behavior. If victims hold their partners at fault for their abusive behavior, attributing the abuse to personality factors such as an inability to manage anger, a refusal to take responsibility for their behavior, or a lack of empathy, then they will be more likely to leave an abusive relationship. And there's a little quote I have over there on the right: abuse is not love, it is about control. And that's what it boils down to. Victims who tend to attribute their partner's abusive behavior to situational or outside sources, such as work stressors, family problems, or even alcoholism, will have a greater likelihood of forgiving the batterer quickly and returning to the abusive relationship. The behavioral health professional can assist the victim in learning how to attribute causality of the abusive behavior to the batterer, incorporating an even-if attitude. So this t-shirt over here on the right is something that really captures the essence of what an abusive person will say. I'm so sorry, but you provoked me. I was drunk. I was having a bad day. I hate you. I didn't mean it. I couldn't help it. And again, That's where you see that external locus of control is. That is everybody's fault but mine. For instance, the client might be responsible for responding to her husband's question in an irritated tone, but she is not responsible for her husband's choice to hit her in response. That was his choice, and it was unwarranted and an unreasonable response, one for which he was completely responsible. A common clinical issue in helping someone develop new boundaries is the experience of unreasonable guilt. Many victims of domestic violence feel toxic guilt in response to setting limits with others, often believing that saying no to someone or upsetting another person is equivalent to being unkind. And, women for millennia have been socialized to believe that they're the caretakers, they're the people who are responsible for the emotional well-being of their family. And the reality, especially in modern day, is that's just not true. Yes, women are often caretakers, but now men are also caretakers. And there has to be an ability to balance that sense of responsibility for the family's emotional well-being. So, what is controlling the victim? Guilt. Victims of domestic violence will often allow their irrational, and that's the key word, it's irrational guilt, to determine their actions. If an action makes them feel guilty, they wrongly assume that their actions were wrong. This is not correct. Cognitive behavioral therapy, otherwise known as CBT, is a counseling technique commonly used to help victims of domestic violence recognize and change unhealthy relationships. Here's a myth about domestic violence. If I change, they'll change. And remember, abuse isn't about your behavior, it's about their behavior. The person who's abusing you. They're the ones who are wrong. Then you have the social exchange theory. And this theory says that victims of domestic violence enter into a kind of cost-benefit analysis when attempting to make a decision about whether to stay or leave the abusive relationship. If the victims stay in the abusive relationship, where they will be forced to endure more abuse, or will the cost be higher if they leave, possibly facing economic insecurity, navigating the court system if a divorce is imminent, and managing work and family responsibilities alone. So, if you think of a scale and, people are weighing, do I stay and get the crap beat out of me, or do I leave and possibly deal with living in economic poverty? So this investment model of decision making is often used when attempting to realistically weigh pros and cons. And a lot of women, especially women, will find that they'd rather put up with the abuse than deal with putting their children in a poverty environment. Now, that concept is actually not accurate. The cost to staying means enduring abuse of increasing escalation. And when I say increasing escalation is the beatings get worse. There's less time between the beatings. They may move into the kind of violence where somebody would be hospitalized or even murdered. And worst of all, the abuse could trickle down to the children. However, the cost of leaving may mean enduring financial hardship and other struggles related to managing work and family alone. So while you see in the first option the conditions can get worse, what you have to remember is in the second issue, enduring the financial hardship and other struggles, typically those issues get better with time. Behavioral health professionals can help victims of domestic violence more effectively process the pros and cons of leaving by helping them evaluate realistic risk factors and accurate scenarios. Counseling can also assist victims in learning how to manage more effectively without lapsing into negative thinking. A major way to provide assistance is to teach victims of domestic violence how to obtain factual information about their financial situation, including learning the laws related to an equitable division of property and the likely levels of child support and spousal maintenance. And one of those issues that you have to keep in mind is these laws often vary from state to state. This will assist victims of domestic violence in making good decisions that are based on fact and not fear. A generalist approach is most effective, often involving case management, court advocacy, individual counseling, group support, counseling children and adolescents, providing housing assistance, job coaching, and assistance with life skills. The behavioral health professional working with victims of domestic violence must be familiar with contemporary theories of abuse, effective intervention strategies, common clinical disorders associated with being a survivor of domestic violence, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise as PTSD, domestic violence laws, and remember they're different in every state. The criminal justice process also can be different in other states, and resources designed to meet the needs of victims and their children. Any effective counseling program must address the denial, wishful thinking, indiscriminate forgiveness without holding the partner accountable, and a desire to protect the batterer, as well as the fear of the future that many victims of domestic violence experience, which can prevent an honest and realistic appraisal of their abusive relationship. It is vital that behavioral health professionals take the time to understand the dynamics involved and not assume that if an accusation were made, it must be true. One of the most common practice settings to work with victims of domestic violence is a battered woman shelters. Such shelters typically offer numerous services, including a 24-hour hotline for immediate access to information and services, immediate safety shelters for domestic violence victims and their children, individual counseling for all victims, survivor support groups, court advocacy, children's programs, teen programs, information referral, medical advocates who provide on-site support at hospitals, and immigration problems, depending on the ethnic makeup of the community. And one of the interesting things about women's shelters is that there's usually a phone number, and you call a phone number because women's shelters do not advertise their location. And the reason they don't generally advertise their location is because they don't want the abusive partner to show up and demand that his partner be released to him so he can continue the abuse. So you call in, you get the phone number, you call in, and you meet someone, usually in a parking lot of like a Target or a Walmart, and they will take you to the shelter with your children and whatever stuff you manage to get out of the house with. The whole point of a shelter is that you're sheltered from the potential recriminations of the abusive spouse. Actual shelters, as I have said, are sprinkled throughout communities in confidential locations to ensure the safety of the victims utilizing shelter services. Victims of domestic violence and their children usually remain in a shelter for a time determined by their primary counselor. But the goal of shelter services focuses on self-sufficiency, thus job placement, child care assistance, and transportation needs are also addressed. So all of these social issues, all of these life issues are given to these folks in terms of a supportive, let's plan for your future. This isn't an idea of, oh, they're just going to hide away for a few days. No. These folks, they're aiming to get you to self-sufficiency, not trying to run your lives. Behavioral health professionals are assigned to each shelter, living space, and facilitate in-house programs to maintain smooth functioning within the home as well as among the residents. Residents who release this information to their abusive partners will be asked to leave the program. if they give them the address, if they give them any information about where they are, that's it. That's termination time. Residents are also required to work on the meeting of program goals, and serious noncompliance may also be a reason to terminate services. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act was passed under President Clinton. This act established policies and mandates for how states were to handle domestic violent cases, such as encouraging mandatory arrests, encouraging interstate enforcement of domestic violence laws, and maintaining a state database on incidences of domestic violence. This act also provides for numerous grants for educational purposes, for example, the education of police officers and judges about domestic violence, a domestic violence hotline, battered women shelters, and to improve the safety of public areas such as public transportation and parks. Since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, incidents of domestic violence have been cut in half. And this goes to the point that if you can get people to come together in a political way to ensure certain legislation is passed, it can help solve the problem. Advocates are pushing for more protection for immigrant women, as well as an increased safety measures in workplace in future reauthorizations of Violence Against Women Act in order to address the growing problem of violence in these two arenas. So let's talk about those who actually perpetrate the abuse, the abusers. It might be tempting to focus treatment efforts solely on the victims of abuse, leaving the perpetrators of abuse to fend for themselves. But if those who committed abuse were treated effectively, then domestic violence would not be the pressing social problem that it is. It is also important to be aware that not all batterers are alike. There are many batterers who are narcissistic with antisocial tendencies, otherwise known as sociopaths, who abuse their intimate partner with no remorse at all. There are those who act out in anger but are truly remorseful. Number 3, some of who have never committed violence before, but a combination of circumstances lowered their impulse control and they then committed the abuse. Some who are in reciprocally abusive relationships where both partners beat the hell out of each other. And some who have legitimately been falsely accused. You know, a woman who claims that she has been battered is generally believed. So a lot of women who are manipulative or who deal with mental health issues themselves, like people with borderline personality disorder, will oftentimes accuse someone falsely. And therefore, it gets even more complicated as a police officer or a judge where you are attempting to identify, the reality of what's actually going on. Most batterers' intervention programs are based upon the Duluth Model, a psychoeducational program drawn from feminist theory of domestic violence, which posits that domestic violence is caused by patriarchal ideology and men's perception that they have the right to control their female partners. Many batterers' intervention programs are also based upon group treatment using cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, and anger management training. Newer programs combine these models based upon the premise that battering is a complex problem. Thus, a combination of psychoeducation, CBT, and anger management in a group setting will be most successful. So the reality is, a lot of times we have to get the abuser to look at themselves in a realistic assessment of their behavior, and that can be very hard because we love being in denial. On the other hand, people who are willing to go through these processes might learn why they engage in this behavior and then are able to change their behaviors. Most batterers treatment programs have similar goals, including increasing awareness of violent behavior and encouraging the batterer to take responsibility for violent behavior. Common program philosophies include the following beliefs. Violence is intentional. Domestic violence uses physical force and intimidation as coercive methods to obtain and maintain control in the relationship. Using violence is a learned behavior and it can be unlearned. It's an addiction that has to be treated in a sense because the behavior is learned at such a young age usually that people don't even realize they're learning it. And that's why getting your children out of an abusive relationship is so important. You don't want your children to grow up thinking this is the right way to treat your spouse. Another issue that has been gaining traction over the last 3 or 4 decades is the idea of, you can be raped by your partner, your husband, your wife, whomever. Well, mostly your husband. Sexual assault involves forcing some form of sexual act on another person without his or her consent. Approximately 1 in 5 women in the United States have been raped sometime during their lifetime, and more than half of them were raped by intimate partners. You might have heard the talk of date rape. Well, there's also marital rape. You and your husband or your boyfriend are engaged in an argument. It becomes physical, and to dominate you, he will hold you down and rape you. Previously, the legal definition of forcible rape was the carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. That definition, unchanged since 1927, was outdated and narrow. It only included forcible male penile penetration of a female vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. This was an important victory for advocates, since this expanded definition, recognizing that some people cannot give consent due to mental or physical disability. So who gets raped? Approximately 170,000 women 12 years old and older and 15,000 men were raped or sexually assaulted in 2010. About 75% of all women who were raped were assaulted by perpetrators they knew, and only about 25% were assaulted by strangers. Black women are raped at a higher rate relative to the population statistics than white or Hispanic women. Only half of all rapes and sexual assaults in 2010 were reported to police. And that's a big issue, is that, and we see it every day with, whatever celebrity is brought out into public that he is sexually abusive or a rapist. People always question the victim. Why was she there? Why did she do that? What was she wearing? Why was she out so late? And again, women and men who are raped do not want to be interrogated about the choices they may have made about their wardrobe or where they were. There are, according to the CDC, 4 categories of rape and sexual assault. Number 1, completed sexual acts such as sexual penetration, but may also include any act of sexual nature attempted or otherwise, such as between a sexual organ and another part of the body. So that weirdo guy who rubs his penis against your clothed leg in the subway, that's sexual assault. Attempted sexual assault, abusive sexual contact such as intentional touching, even through clothing, and non-sexual abuse such as intentional exposure and exhibitionism. So, that weird guy who walks through the park and opens up his raincoat to show you his shortcomings, that's assault. So why do people commit rape? One of the most common myths of why rape occurs include blaming the victim by asserting that the victim wanted it, liked it, or in some way deserved the sexual assault because he or she provoked the assailant by how they dressed, by how they acted. Myths about rapists include assertions that only truly evil or insane men rape, and that men just cannot control their sexual desires, and thus are not ultimately responsible for sexually assaulting women. Well, there's a whole bunch of men out there who have never raped a woman. What makes them so different? Western social customs may claim to reject rape. Popular rape myths provide rapists a way around such social mores by convincing themselves that the women in some way asked for it by how they dressed, and that men simply cannot control themselves, in that idea of boys will be boys, and that thus they really haven't done anything wrong, or at least nothing that many other men don't do all the time. Rape trauma syndrome is similar to PTSD and is commonly experienced after a forced, violent sexual assault. The person experiences both psychological and physical symptoms, including extreme fear, consistent crying, and sleep disturbances. Rape survivors will avoid social interaction, experience a loss of self-esteem, inappropriate guilt, and clinical depression. Rape crisis advocates refer to clients as survivors rather than as victims to reduce the stigma by focusing on the strength it takes to survive a sexual assault. One of the other issues that hasn't really made the news too much but is becoming more prevalent is the concept known as male-on-male sexual assault. Now, I'm not saying gay sex, I'm talking about male-on-male, because oftentimes men who commit sexual assault on other men, it's not about being gay, it's about power. So men are also victims of sexual assault in the form of child sexual abuse, same-sex date rape, and male-on-male stranger rape. In many states, the legal definition of rape does not even account for men being victims. Most incidences of male-on-male rape go unreported. Research on male-on-male sexual assault is sparse, with the exception of some early efforts to identify the nature and dynamics of male rape. Treating men who have been sexually assaulted is similar in some respects to serving the female survivor population, except that the shame men feel, although equal in intensity, tends to be more focused on their gender identity as males. Men also have a greater tendency to turn towards alcohol and drugs in response to their rape. Now, I don't agree with this concept, but for many men, being put in the victim position of a male rape makes them feel feminized, and they are very uncomfortable with that. And obviously, being a woman, there's no big deal about that. I'm one. It's cool. I like it. But a lot of men feel that if they are raped by another man, it has reduced their masculinity. Behavioral health professionals who work directly with victims of sexual assault usually do so at a rape crisis center or sexual assault advocacy organization. These professionals who work with sexual assault victims receive from 40 to 50 hours of specialized training focusing on the history of the rape crisis movement, the nature of crisis counseling, rape myths, and the dangers of gender oppression. Training also includes information on normal child and adult developmental stages and how these stages are affected by sexual violence and trauma. Okay, so now we're going to move on to violent crime and victims' rights. In 2004, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey, 24 million crimes were committed, 5.2 million of which were violent in nature. Although violent crimes have been declining in recent years, the issue of victimization and the recognition and enforcement of victims' rights remains as relevant an issue for behavioral health professionals. The victims movement is based not on the desire to lessen the rights of criminal defendants, but rather on the desire to increase the rights of victims. Most victims and victim advocates state that the primary goal of the victims movement is to ensure that crime victims have a voice within the community, specifically within the criminal justice system. In response to the victims movement and subsequent federal legislation, all states now have a Victims' Bill of Rights, ensuring basic rights as well as protection. Although there is some variation from state to state, most states ensure that victims of violent crime can be afforded the following rights: the right to be treated with dignity and fairness and with respect for the victim's dignity and privacy, the right to be reasonably protected from the accused offender, the right to be notified of court proceedings, the right to be present at all public court proceedings related to the offense unless the court determines that testimony by the victim would materially be affected if the victim heard other testimony at trial. So if you are going to be testifying against the person who committed the offense, they're going to keep you out of the court until it's your turn to give testimony. And then after you've given your testimony, they generally allow you back in court at your discretion. The right to confer with the attorney for the government in the case, the right to restitution, the right to information about the conviction, sentencing, imprisonment, and release of the offender. And again, this all comes from the Victims' Rights Act of 1998, also signed by President Clinton. In response to federal legislation and Victims' Bill of Rights, state prosecution units within prosecutors' offices, usually a state's attorney, a district attorney, or the attorney general offices, develop specialized units called victim witness assistants designed to enforce victims' rights. And you will, if you ever watch Law and Order SVU with Mariska Hargitay, you'll always see the victims' rights advocates being brought in to help the rape victims. Behavioral health professionals work within these departments offering the following services: crisis intervention counseling, referrals to coordinating human service agencies such as a rape crisis center, battered woman shelters, and crime victim support groups. Referrals to advocacy organizations such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who have made a presence in court to ensure enforcement of victims' rights. Advocacy and accompaniment in court proceedings. Special services or units for victims of domestic violence, child victims, older adults, and victims with disabilities. Case status updates, including notification of all public court proceedings, foreign language translation, assistance with obtaining compensation such as reimbursement for counseling and medical costs, and assistance in preparing and writing a victim impact statement to be read by the victim at the sentence hearing. And oftentimes a family will all write letters, but one member of the family will actually stand up and read a letter that the whole family has written together. Victim witness advocates may have a master's degree in any of the applied social science disciplines, social work, psychology, general human services, but often work at the bachelor's level with some specialized training in the dynamics involved in violent crime. Victim witness advocates can help crime victims understand the process of a criminal trial and the importance and value of each step within the prosecution process. If a case goes to trial, the victim witness advocate will work closely with the victims to prepare them for testifying. In each instance, the victim witness advocate will work with community service agencies and advocates to provide support and assistance to the victim, again in preparation of the trial. It is the responsibility of the victim witness advocate to assist victims in writing their victim impact statement, which will be read in open court before the judge, jury, and defendant. Some of the most emotionally intense and difficult cases of victim witness advocates are homicide cases, particularly when the primary victim is a child. The victim witness advocate must develop a threshold for dealing with another's emotional pain, because the pain of losing a loved one through violence is often unlike any other loss. Research strongly suggests the importance of providing supportive counseling services and advocacy in the weeks immediately following the homicide. This approach is important in light of research, which suggests that surviving victims of homicide are most likely to utilize advocacy services during the initial crisis phase. So as a therapist, as the person who is working with the victim, your job as an advocate is to be their support system. But you yourself must also learn how to compartmentalize, how to separate your life, your personal life, your family, your hobbies from your job. And that's a very difficult thing, and there's a lot of burnout in this field because of that. But there's also a lot of extremely valuable experiences that people walk away with feeling like they've made a true difference in someone else's life. Common clinical issues when working with victims of all violent crimes. So regardless of the nature of the crime committed, victims of violent crime all have basic needs that need to be addressed by the behavioral health professionals working with them in treatment. These issues or treatment goals include the following. Number 1, building formal and informal social support systems. Who is it in your life who can be a supporting person? Is it a family member? Is it a friend? Is it a group of friends? Reinforcing ways to regain a sense of safety. How do you feel safe if someone broke into your house and killed a family member? Do you move? Do you put extra locks on? Do you get a security system? Teaching victims how to manage their emotions such as anger, sadness, and fear. And then finally, achieving physical and psychological stability. Number 5, building skills that will help victims regain a sense of personal power and control over their lives. And that's really one of the biggest issues, is when a person who is dealing with homicide and really any violent crime, they don't feel like they have any control left because the control was taken away from them. And so helping them rebuild or regain this sense of power over their own lives is a difficult task, but it's probably one of the most important. Educating the client on the nature of the crime victimization so they know what to expect. Number 7, reconditioning victims to minimize negative triggering of the traumatic incident. Number 8, helping victims through the mourning process. Number 9, seeking resolution and closure, which leads to personal growth and allows the victim to regain the confidence and strength to trust people once again. And that's another big issue to deal with, is that, if you were raped, if you were assaulted, any of these things by a stranger, how do you regain that confidence to trust people? How do you not walk onto a bus or a subway or move into a new apartment building and rebuild a friendship or build a new relationship? It's very difficult to gain that sense of control back. Behavioral health professionals working in the criminal justice area often work with victims, but they may also work with the offenders or perpetrators of crime. And now we're going to talk about gang activity, because that's very prevalent in urban environments. Gangs consist of groups of individuals who actively participate in criminal activities on an organized or coordinated basis. Gang activity remains primarily a big city phenomenon, with some of the larger cities having more than 30 gangs operating at one time. And, one of the big places is Chicago, has a lot of gang activity. Los Angeles has a lot of gang activity. You don't see quite as much gang activity in New York City because of the various and sundry laws that were put in place under Mayor Rudy Giuliani, where they were very controversial, but they were involving stopping and frisking people without cause. And, the idea of cause was very amorphous. But what ended up happening is people stopped carrying guns. And because of that, you tended to see less homicides and less extreme violence. Gang members not only commit crimes such as theft and drug trafficking to support gang activity, but also more serious crimes. In some inner-city communities, drive-by shootings are a way of life. Most gang members are between the ages of 13 and 25. You don't become an old gangster, you die out. Most gang members come from backgrounds of poverty and racial oppression, live in high-crime urban communities, and live in neighborhoods with high gang activity. And for a lot of young men, it's impossible to avoid joining a gang. You are brought into the gang as a mandatory activity. There are several theories regarding why adolescents join gangs. Theories focus on the sense of solidarity and the feelings of belonging that gangs can provide disenfranchised youth. So if you grow up in the city and maybe your dad's not around and your mom works 2 jobs to pay the rent and keep food on the table, you're not getting a lot of adult supervision. So finding a family on the streets becomes a substitute. Identifying risk factors is important so that effective intervention strategies can be developed and put into action. A comprehensive study facilitated by the Department of Justice evaluated the gang membership and backgrounds of over 800 gang members from 1985 to 2001 in an attempt to identify some of the reasons why adolescents join these gangs. It is referred to as the Seattle Social Development Project. This study found that the majority of gang members joined for only a short time, with 70% of youths belonging to a gang for less than a year. Multiple risk factors for gang membership included living in high-crime neighborhoods, coming from a single-parent household, poverty, parents who approve of violence, poor academic performance, learning disabilities, little or no commitment to school, early drug and alcohol abuse, and associating with friends who commit delinquent acts. Behavioral health professionals who work with gang populations may do so on school campuses, in agencies that target at-risk youth, in faith-based outreach agencies, at police departments, or within the juvenile justice system. Most outreach programs target adolescents who live in large urban communities where gang activity is prolific and violent behavior a fact of life, especially those who come from single-parent homes, have poor academic histories, and have shown early signs of delinquent behaviors. They also target social conditions on a macro level, such as poverty, racism, and the lack of opportunities in urban communities, because these factors contribute to the development of gang activity. Many programs that target at-risk adolescents operate after-school programs or evening community programs that give adolescents a place to go to socialize other than the streets. The research indicates that these types of programs have the potential of being successful in steering even active gang members away from gang life. And to put it in the most basic terms, when you're dealing with a toddler who's 2 or 3 years old and they're trying to, touch something you don't want them to touch, what you do is you redirect their focus. And that's what these interventionists are doing with at-risk adolescents. They're redirecting their energies into something more positive and productive, and giving them a sense of solidarity and belongingness. The criminal justice system includes jails, prisons, government probation departments, police departments, and agencies offering services to recently released offenders. Working within the criminal justice system, professionals will likely encounter a wide range of issues that vary with the level of incarceration security, the gender and race of the prisoners, and the culture and climate of the specific prison. Behavioral health professionals may also work on a community level advocating for prison reform, such as the development of mental health courts, substance abuse for mentally ill prisoners. The clinical issues are specialized, requiring training focusing on the common issues facing offenders both within prison and on release. So if you have a prisoner who is dealing with bipolar disorder, and instead of being on their medication, they're drinking and using drugs to manage their symptoms, you are dealing with a whole different kind of situation than someone who is a criminal but not necessarily mentally ill. Approximately 55% of all federal prisoners are incarcerated for drug-related offenses, and 80% of the increase in prisoners in the federal prison system between 1985 and 1995 is related to increased convictions of drug-related offenses. Many argue that the federal government's aggressive policies related to the prosecution and punishment of drug offenders unfairly targets poor, young ethnic minorities, many of whom are serving extremely long prison sentences due to minimum federal sentencing guidelines. And that can be up to 20 years to life, despite not committing any violent crime. So back in the 80s and 90s, we had the war on crime, or war on drugs. And the idea was that you got 3 strikes. So if you are carrying crack cocaine or heroin and you get arrested 3 times, you could go to prison for life, despite not being a violent criminal. And of course, once you go into prison, that's like finishing school for prisoners. They learn how to be better criminals. So, each time somebody goes into jail, there's the potential that, they're going to come out as a worse criminal. So putting people who haven't committed any violent crime in prison seems like a contradiction of what the prison system is for. And when President Obama took office, that was one of the things that he was working on, was let's look at these drug users, and instead of treating them as criminals, let's work on treating them as addicts who need health care. Advocates should be concerned about any governmental policy that either directly or indirectly targets a certain segment of the population. The war on drugs appears to do just this, evidenced by the significant overrepresentation of ethnic minorities, particularly African American men, within the federal and state prison system. President Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, told Harper's Magazine that the war on drugs was created as a political tool to vilify the black community, and he said that in 2016. President Nixon, for those of you who were not even on the planet yet, served as president from 1968 till 73 or so, 74. He had to resign because he had committed some very ridiculous crimes. He had people breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters and stealing information. But the real reason he had to leave office is because he lied about it. And he also taped himself discussing it, and of course those tapes came out. It is important to be aware of potentially unfair political policies to develop a truly objective perspective of social conditions leading to the overrepresentation of minorities in correctional facilities. The reasoning behind sentencing guidelines for various criminal offenses, even identifying social influences that tend to hold one behavior in a particular era as socially acceptable, only to criminalize it several decades later. So, here is a statistic that should absolutely blow your mind. A white male with a criminal record is 5% more likely to get a job over a man of color with a clean record. That is just absolutely mind-boggling, and it should tell you that, the system is rigged. It's not fair. We don't have an even playing field. Female inmates are often incarcerated for offenses related to drug addiction, writing bad checks, petty theft, prostitution. Behavioral health professionals working in a correctional facility will likely encounter women, particularly, again, women of color, who are grieving over the loss of their children or are anticipating their loss once they give birth. One of the roles of human service professionals is to work with outside agencies that can arrange to transport children to see their incarcerated mothers to maintain the mother-child bond, which, based on our knowledge of the bonding process, is absolutely essential for the child to grow up feeling that they can trust the world. Approximately 8% of women who enter prison are pregnant, and about 1,000 give birth each year during their incarceration. Some prisons have grant-funded programs that provide intensive prenatal care, nutritional counseling, substance abuse treatment, and individual and group counseling. Notice the word some prisons. Not all women's prisons provide this. One such program is called the Women and Infants at Risk, which helps mothers break intergenerational cycles of abuse, giving infants the best start in life possible. Diseases such as hepatitis B, hepatitis C are prevalent in some prisons, and HIV/AIDS remain a serious concern among prisoners and correctional staff alike. A 2002 report by the National Commission on Correctional Facilities indicated that the incidence of AIDS in U.S. prison population is 5 times that of the general population, and the primary method of transmission is sexual assault. That is also a very shocking number. Male rape while incarcerated. People always joke around about, oh, you're going to go to prison and drop the soap. Well, it's actually not that funny. It's not funny at all. It's actually appalling. The fear of being raped is the #1 fear among men serving time in prison. It is estimated that between 7 and 12% of the male prison population have been victim of sexual assault while incarcerated, although the actual number is presumed to be much higher, with many prisoners suffering multiple rapes throughout their incarceration. That does not mean that man-on-man sex in prison is always rape. Some men, especially those who are in for very long sentences, will develop relationships with other men to, have sex, just to have sex. It is consensual, and usually the prison guards don't care because they're not dealing with potential rape or violence. One complaint among mental health providers in correctional settings is the underfunding and understaffing of mental health programs, often experienced in many jails and prisons across the country. Yet, even in prisons that have sufficient mental health services, barriers still exist that often prevent prisoners from accessing these services. So if you look over here on the right-hand side, this is from the U.S. Department of Justice, and these are what they tend to see on a regular basis. 21% have depressive disorder, depression or major depression. Number 2 is bipolar disorder, 12%. Schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder, 5%. Post-traumatic stress disorder, 7%. Anxiety disorders, 8%. And personality disorders, 6%. And that number is really underestimated compared to what's diagnosed and what's actually going on. So when you look at these numbers, you're looking at almost 50% of the men and women in prison dealing with mental health issues. A 2004 study surveying prisoner attitudes about mental health services identified several perceived barriers to service, including being uncertain how or when to access counseling, a belief that mental health services are for crazy people, the lack of confidentiality involved in the counseling relationship, with a fear that the information shared would be later used against them, and a fear that other prisoners would believe they were a snitch. Professionals need to be aware of these common perceptions held by prisoners so that strategies can be designed to overcome both real and perceived barriers to seeking mental health counseling. So finally, let's talk about what is the goal of incarceration. The goal is to reduce recidivism, which is the likelihood of a released inmate returning to correctional institution. Rehabilitation offers the most hope of lowering recidivism rates among the prison population. Yet, correctional philosophy that incorporates rehabilitation is controversial because in the eyes of many in the general public, counseling and other mental health programs feel like too much of a luxury and not deserved by those who have committed the crimes. Those who have committed the most serious offenses are in many cases those who need the most mental health services. For this reason, it is imperative that advocates argue for the basic rights and needs of prisoners, especially when you have a typo, as they do with all vulnerable populations. So, we may not like what the person has done, but there's a reason that they did it. And if we can provide services that will help support them so they don't deal with this when they get out of jail and they can go on to live a functional life, then we have been successful in our job. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text your instructor. If you do not attend this college, please leave a comment and we will return your comment answer as late as we can. Thank you and have a great day.